Welcome to AIAP Show and Tell, a behind-the-scenes look at how America's best architectural photographers create their amazing photographs. Today's show is a technical presentation by AIAP Director Alan Blakely. Now, let's hear from Alan.
All right, I'm going to talk today about a method that I brought up a couple times that I use with a tilt-shift lens, and it's a modified panorama. And when we think about panoramas, typically we think about a wide horizontal type photograph, and that's not at all what this is. And the way I use a tilt-shift lens is a little bit different than what I started out with. When I first started using a tilt-shift lens, it was mostly to frame a photograph. Now I use it in order to create a photograph that I probably couldn't create in any other way. And so let me go ahead and move to this next slide here. And the reasons I use one, the tilt shift in this modified panorama is because I don't like using wide lenses necessarily. And so in this first image here, you can see that I've used a tilt shift lens in a panorama kind of configuration. To do a vertical panorama, I've used a 35 millimeter lens to give me an image that's almost square here, where I would have probably needed to use maybe a 24 and maybe something that was even wider than that. And then this middle one here is a 17 millimeter lens that I've stacked 3 images vertically in a panorama, vertically to give an image that I probably would needed something in the order of maybe an 8 or a 10 or a 12 millimeter lens to get that shot. And then this other one here, I would have at least needed to use a 17 millimeter lens in order to do this panorama. And so this way I use this in shifting the lens to give me this perspective with a longer lens gives me a wider coverage, but I can use a little bit longer lens in order to do that. And I can also give a format that may not fit that 35 millimeter aspect ratio that I really don't like. And this kind of goes back to, shooting years ago with a Hasselblad or a 4x5. And I didn't really like the 35 millimeter format all that well. And I never really shot 35 millimeter commercially. And so my brain was kind of programmed into that square format of that 4x5 or 8x10 aspect ratio, because those were the film formats I shot in. And so going to digital, I ended up going into that 35 millimeter, and it just was really hard to, put things into that cropped kind of format. And so that's why I started using a tilt shift lens in this way, was to try to work outside of that format. And so the way to put this together is to choose the lens based on the aesthetics of the shot. The lens that you think is the right lens for the shot, not necessarily the lens that is the right lens to capture the entire shot. And so there's a few things that you have to keep in mind when you do this. And the first thing is you've got to just be leveled out and completely level and plumb. And your camera really has to be locked down in order to do this right, so that you can stitch those images together. Typically, when I'm doing this, I'm putting together a shot where I keep the camera horizontal and I'm shifting the lens in a vertical, direction. So I'm shifting it either up or down or both, and putting together images vertically so that I can create either a square or a vertical format, or just a slightly more rectangular type format. But then I also we'll do this in a compound situation where I'm shifting it both horizontally and vertically at the same time. And those of you that have tilt shift lenses, you may not have discovered yet, or maybe you have, that these lenses will shift diagonally if you depress that little side button while you turn the little wheel on the side, so that you can compose an image differently than where you may be in setting it up from the vantage point that you're standing at. So typically I will set up a shot and I will compose an image based on the relationship of the objects in the shot, where I like them, but that may not be the way I want to frame the shot. So I may set things up based on where I want a column and a table and, people or whatever in the shot, but that may not be the position that the shot is best framed from. So I can use these compound movements in the tilt shift lens to then tweak that shot in a direction that might be going, horizontally and vertically, or horizontally and only slightly vertically or something, and get a shot that's composed in a way that your eye could never compose it, or a fixed lens could never compose it. So the tilt shift lens offers some flexibility that way, and you can also do panoramas in that regard. And then you can put those shots together if it's just a couple shots, usually in Lightroom. Lightroom, if you use Control M, will stitch those together for you. You can also export into Photoshop to stitch a panorama together in Photoshop. Usually Photoshop will do 2 or 3 images together pretty successfully. Sometimes if you've got a lot of images together, it's, let's say you've got 4 or 6 or more than that, it's best if you do them in smaller groups and then put those smaller groups together as one final image. If you get into a situation where Lightroom and Photoshop are just not successful, then you may end up having to go to a third-party software like PT GUI Pro. And PT GUI Pro is a software that I've used for a lot of years. And the thing I like about it personally is that it gives me a lot of different possibilities as far as putting these together. I can choose the points that it stitches at, and so I can manipulate the stitching points together, and then I can also choose the projections so that I can get a projection that is perfect as far as showing something that looks right to your eye, that's not warped or rounded or distorted. And so that's why I like that a lot. So this is an image that I'm going to talk about today. This is an auditorium at a high school that I photographed earlier this year. Yeah. Yeah, this is what high school looks like these days. So the image that the architect wanted was one with a bunch of high school students in the aisles and on the stage in motion. And, of course, I couldn't do that as a composite photograph. And so I did that photograph, and I wasn't able to shoot an image. I used my 17 millimeter lens on my Canon 5D SR. And even with that lens, I wasn't able to capture the entire auditorium to this extent. And I just felt like it was kind of a failure. I got what the architect wanted me to get, but I just was not happy with it. And I couldn't get the shot I wanted because I had to get, people in the shot. And it just was not, it was an impossible shot to get with the layers that I had to do with the people and everything. So I went back the next day. Now, so this is the finished shot, but I wanted to use a 24 millimeter lens because the 17 just looked stupid wide to me. And I probably should have showed you the finished shot that I did for them. But this is the 24 millimeter field of view on the left here, which is not really very wide, considering how big that auditorium is. And so I came up with a stitching plan, which meant that I needed to have 9 images that I was going to stitch together in order to use that 24 millimeter lens. And so in order to do that, I backed up here, and I wanted to show the entrance there because I thought that those cast concrete panels were interesting on the walls, especially in that entrance area there, as well as on the walls, and then the acoustical panels on the ceiling and on the walls, and then the way that the seats were positioned. It was just really an impressive shot to my eye from this vantage point. So I ended up metering this, and my meter told me that in order to put this together, I couldn't light this necessarily, but in order to blend this, I was going to have to do bracket ranges of 9 images. And so I had, that's 81 images total that I was going to have to capture. And so starting out with, the 9 images here, this required me using those compound movements where I was both shifting vertically and also shifting horizontally with the lens, doing these compound movements to get these 9 different image segments. So I took those 9 different bracket ranges, and then I blended them each in Aurora HDR. So I ended up with 9 different images that were they were slightly overlapped, and I recommend that you overlap, 25 to 30% on these things if you're going to do something like this. But I still have that 24 millimeter field of view. I mean, that I've got the perspective of a 24 millimeter lens, even though I really have the field, the coverage area of an 8 millimeter lens. But if I'd shot this with an 8 millimeter lens, it would have looked like the stage was, a half a mile away. So that wasn't really a viable prospect to me. So this is the finished shot again here. And it looks like a 24 millimeter lens perspective, but it's got the coverage of what would normally be an 8 millimeter lens. And so this is a technique that I use quite a lot in, going back to these images here. These are images that I've captured here just within the last few months. And I use this probably about 30% of the time on photographs, just so that I don't have to put a longer lens on. Yeah. Or a shorter lens rather. Yeah. So I don't like putting on a 17 millimeter if I don't have to. And I'd really rather not put on a 24 millimeter if I don't have to. So this office area here on the left, I probably would have shot that normally with a 24, but I wouldn't have been able to get the detail up here in the ceiling, which was really important to the architect and the interior designer. And I wouldn't have been able to get, the field of view that gave me the chairs and some of the furniture. And in the shots that I did, we ended up doing, 10 or 12 shots that day of furniture. This is for a financial services company that I had to sign an NDR for, but an NDA. But they wanted to make sure that I showed all of these different elements, but there really wasn't a good way to do it unless I would, turn my camera sideways and have a really narrow 35 millimeter aspect ratio. And that wasn't a good plan for me. And so I ended up shooting a lot of images that were more 4:5 aspect ratio or even square aspect ratio. But I ended up shooting them all with a 35 millimeter lens. So this gave me that field of view that I wanted, but I was able to use the long lens on that. So this is, this is a way that I use a tilt shift lens, which is kind of a little different than what most people would choose to use one, but it gives me a little bit more flexibility in not having to use what I just think are just stupid wide lenses for shots that are really pretty wide shots. Any questions anybody has about what I've done on these?
Alan, is all the color that way, just silver like that?
This is a very monochromatic building. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can see that there's a
Wow.
little bit of color in some of those areas in the carpet.
Yeah.
And the stage curtains have a little bit of color. They didn't have the stage curtains were not functional when I shot this, or otherwise I would have liked to have had the curtain drawn, and or else some stage lighting, in the back of house or something on that. But that was not available to me at the time, so I had to shoot that just kind of as a black hole. Not my first choice. The shot that I did for the architect, we had just a group of students who were kind of milling around in a circle, which to me looked a little odd on the stage. And then we had some students that were moving through the aisles. And I shot it from the opposite side of the auditorium. Same vantage point, basically, but I shot it with a 17 millimeter lens, but I didn't get as much of the auditorium in the shot as I did with using the 24 in this way to shoot, the 9 image stitch.
How do you, to get the 9 different panels, you're on a tripod, you have your camera set up, and you're sliding up, or down, and then you just swivel it a little bit, 1/3, and then do the same and swivel again?
Mm-hmm. This one I'm not actually turning the tripod head. Sometimes you have to do that. You'll have to turn the tripod head. This one I didn't have to. I had enough movement in the lens itself, shifting it side to side, that I didn't have, I was able to shift side to side as well as, a rise and a fall, that I didn't have to rotate the head. Sometimes you do. And if you do have to do that, then you have to correct out that rotation.
So it actually, you go up this way, and then it slides, the lens itself slides to the side without the camera moving? Okay, I haven't used a tilt shift before. So that actually, you can go up and down, and then you can just, the
Right.
lens
Yeah.
itself can go to the other area.
Yeah. Right. And I use a grid in the camera. And so I have a grid that, displays on my viewfinder. And I use that grid and points on the grid to tell me where I need to be for these 9 different images. And I use that grid all the time when I'm doing these, so that I know where the overlap is on that. But that's where those compound movements come into play. If you've ever used a view camera, and for people that have used the view camera, these kinds of things are second nature. You got into the habit of using, a rise and a shift all in one movement, and just, setting the camera where the camera needed to be for the relationship of the objects in the room, or wherever you were. you put the camera down where the relationship was right for the objects that you were going to photograph, and then you move that front standard or the rear standard on the camera to frame the shot. And that's basically what you're doing here. And a lot of people buy a tilt shift lens and they only do this with it. It just goes up and down, or it does this. It never does this kind of movement. Or they'll, product photographers will tilt a lot. I used a 90 millimeter tilt shift lens a lot for product photography when I used to have a studio, so that I could get that, front to back focal plane. I get front focus, my point of focus would cover my product from front to back, and I'd use it that way. But in architecture, you don't do that unless you want it to look like, some special tilt shift effect that you can do in Photoshop anyway. But I've only ever had one client that ever asked for that, and I think it looks stupid. But I had some townhomes on a hillside, and they wanted everything behind the townhomes and in front of the townhomes out of focus, and I can do that, with the tilt shift lens, but I think it looks dumb. So I did that way. But this is, I think exploring the options of a tilt shift lens is really important. And this is one way to use a longer lens. When I show that 35 millimeter example, that's actually on the Canon, that's actually a 24 millimeter lens with a 1.4 extender on it. So it's not really a 35. I've got a 35 millimeter Nikon that I use, but that, I'm thinking about, that was not the 35 millimeter Nikon. That was actually a 24 with a 1.4 extender that I used on that particular shot. But I use a 35 millimeter Nikon lens with a Canon adapter on it quite a lot, which is also a really great lens for architecture. It's the 35 millimeter PC lens. But you can go Nikon to Canon, but for some reason you can't go Canon to Nikon, and which I think is a shame. But
I'm definitely gonna try this. I've seen this a few times. I couldn't figure out. I had asked you like how you did it. The way that I've personally done it is since it's on an L bracket, is I'll go vertical. I'll do like 3 vertical basically shots and kind of stitch those together.
Yeah, and you can turn your camera vertically, and you can get that kind of panorama effect. And back when I used to do virtual tours, I had a client that used to ask for virtual tours, and I used to do them that way. I would just do turn the camera vertically, and I do this, a 360, and then stitch them together. This was years and years ago, and we do that all vertically. But this to me, it just seemed like there was always something I felt like I was leaving out, either at the top or the bottom of the frame, when I was shooting in this 35 millimeter rigid format. And I just always wanted to, just squeeze a little bit. I just, wanted to get back to that 4:5 aspect ratio that I was so used to in film, and or else even go back to, the square of the Hasselblad format. So this gets you kind of back in that same direction. And the nice thing is that if you got clients that are not stuck in social media formats, or even if they are, this gives them a little flexibility. If they, if you got a graphic designer on board with a little bit of imagination, then they can use these images in a way that I think is a lot more interesting on the page than having everything be in that same 35 millimeter aspect ratio.
Do you deliver in that full resolution of that stitch?
I do. They can always crop it, and they do, and they will crop it. Well, I don't, I don't deliver. I mean, this, I don't deliver this in the size that it was originally stitched in.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
what I was asking.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry, I misunderstood that. Yeah, because that was enormous.
yeah.
Because that was, that was like, I don't know, that was like 27,000 pixels wide. So no, I don't deliver that. They can't open that. So I will shrink that down, and I'll deliver these just as normal images for them.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
that's, most people, if you give them something beyond 9,000 pixels wide, it starts to be a problem for them. So I usually don't do that. But that's usually about where I'm.
You still just use Dropbox when you have files that big?
I use WeTransfer generally for my stuff when I send people files. That's the service that I've used. And normally the reason I use that is because lately I've started collecting payments at the same time. So, and Pixieset the same way if they want to, get full resolution images. I do still have some clients that like me to use Dropbox, and I'll do that if it's their account. But for most people, I use WeTransfer, and then I don't carry accounts too much, and so I'll just, they make the payment and it goes through Stripe, and they make the download, and we're done.
Alan, I'm curious if you use like circular polarizers when you shoot. And so for a shot like this, would you use that? Because as you're, yeah, I mean, that's the thing is I've done some stitched panoramas like this, but I've never done one that's as encompassing as this, 9 different shots where you're going diagonally and all the way around. I mean, I would love to hear just, I mean, Glenn's question before was similar to this, but just how do you ensure that you're getting all of your overlaps right? And, as you're moving the lens, you got to be very careful not to touch your focus, to be very careful that you're not changing anything. Like, that's one of the benefits of shooting tethered is you don't have to actually touch your camera, but the more that you touch it, the more possibility that you have of things moving where that stitch isn't going to be exactly right. And that's been some of the issues that I've had. And I even try to do vertical polarization on, a stitch, so up and down, and then bring it back and then change that polarization to horizontal and then do the same stitch and blend those together so that way I can cut reflections on all the surfaces that I want. But as everybody here will know, that's a huge pain in the ass. That's a lot of work. Stitching everything and then blending it and making sure it all aligns is really a lot. So I'm curious just on what your approach is, if there's things you do or don't do to ensure that you're getting the result you want.
Well, honestly, the stitching is less finicky than you'd think on something like this. If you do overlap, and I'm overlapping like 25% on these, and so the software has an auto align feature to it, and so it's going to find those control points on its own generally. And this, where it's got so many angular surfaces, it has a really easy time of finding control points. The nice thing about the PT GUI Pro is that you can designate the control points manually on that if you need to. But on this one, I did use a circular polarizer, but I had to adjust it between every shot. And so, it's 9 different adjustments to do that. And it's not a lot. And I also checked focus on every single shot. But you've got to, you physically have to grab that lens and, rotate the lens and rotate and then turn the ring so that you're moving that lens. And, it's not a lot different than when back when you'd shoot film and you'd have 3 different light sources in a room or something, and you'd have to change, you'd lock the camera down and then you'd have to make 3 or 4 different exposures using different filter packs on the same sheet of film. It was the same kind of thing where you do it 3 or 4 times just to make sure that you got one that was perfect. And I did this one 3 or 4 times just to make sure that I had one that was perfect. And so that's the same kind of thing that you have to do in a situation like this. And to be honest, I wouldn't do this very often. This is the kind of thing that this is one shot from one shoot that I did this way. This is the only shot that of this complexity that I did out of a 2-day shoot. So there were other shots that I did where I maybe stitched maybe 30% of the time out of 2 days. I had shots where I did 2 shots together, vertically. But this was the only one that I did of this complexity.
Yeah, that's a lot of complexity. I mean, I from experience, just shooting on doing 2 images is already a lot, just from file management and bringing it all together and making sure that you got the right selections. If you shot it multiple times to ensure that it's right, or if you're including models in the lower frame and then you're going higher, if you're adding any lighting or anything like that, it can really become a file managing nightmare in some cases to make sure that you're looking at the right ones and you're blending the right ones. So I give you tons of credit for doing a level of this complex and making it look awesome. Like, this is a beautiful image.
Well, I know you keep saying it's easy. I'm like,
practice. Don't do this on your client stuff without knowing.
I've been doing this I started doing this kind of thing about 15 years ago, just playing with it, because I just got frustrated with sticking with that same, that 35 millimeter aspect ratio. But I do this with people, if I'm just doing 2, if it's just 2 shots vertically out and I have people in the frame, I'm not too concerned about it, honestly. I'll do that a lot. I did one of the Golden Gate Bridge Visitor Center, and that was one where I did 6 frames, I think, and that was one that I wish I hadn't done like that, because that was really complicated, and I had cars in it, and that was a nightmare, because I wanted to get the bridge towers the full height, and I wanted to get from the San Francisco side clear to Marin, and the visitor center in the foreground, and I wanted to use a 35 millimeter lens and not a 17, and the whole thing. So yeah, that was a mess, but it worked. But it took me a day so in processing. But so I wouldn't recommend this for all kinds of things, but for just a few things where you're really trying to cheat the frame a little bit, I think it's a great technique.
Now, I've done this with a drone.
Yeah.
Which obviously you're probably not going to do inside the building, but with a drone, I did let it do its own panorama, and it was a nightmare. It just was. There were thousands of photos, so I just thought, well, I know how to do this. So the drone is automatically level. So it actually, you just kind of move around a little bit just to get what you need. And I mean, you do have an advantage. You're up in the air, so you can really frame with more flexibility than you can inside a building, because you can't take out the back wall of an auditorium, for instance, so you can get back a little further. And then it becomes a little bit easier. And, the drone's set up to bracket. So you get your bracket, so you have your HDR and the panorama, and then you can throw that into Lightroom or Photoshop, and it does an okay job.
Yeah, I think it does a great job. I use it on my drone regularly, because again, you may not get what you need within the format of what you're seeing through the viewfinder, and so you want to just stretch that frame a little bit one way or the other. Or if you're shooting a high rise, I was shooting some high rises for a client in San Diego, and I shot every one of those in this same way with the drone, where I shot them as multiple image panoramas. And it worked out just fine. Stitching was not an issue at all.
I think one thing to be careful when you're doing that with a drone, especially for vertical panoramas, is you're not shifting, so your verticals are changing. And when you go to stitch that in Lightroom, there's really only one way to do it where it's not going to curve, and that's in the perspective. You've got the three options. It's like spherical, cylindrical, and then perspective. That's the only way, in my opinion, in my experience, to stitch it where it actually keeps those verticals vertical. Otherwise, it's going to it's going to curve a little bit. And I think I've seen a lot of drone pilots do that, and the effect is interesting sometimes, but for architecture, I think it kind of destroys your image.
And you can't get rid of that curve. I have tried.
It's hard. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to do the real thing, because there's just there's round areas in places that are not accessible. I suppose you could do it with the liquefy mask if you spent half a day, but my God,
Well, I would say that if the PT GUI software does have some projections that will correct that kind of distortion. And that, it's a complicated software sometimes to use, but it will correct out some of those distortions that you absolutely cannot correct in Lightroom or Photoshop. And so it's kind of my go-to when things are not working in Lightroom or Photoshop. Then that's when I open that up. And it does take more time, and you sometimes have to choose those control points manually for the projections. But it does have enough variety of projections that it generally can give you, a rectilinear result, and everything works out just fine.
Thanks for listening to AIAP Show and Tell. Subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss any new episodes. Today's broadcast is copyrighted by the Association of Independent Architectural Photographers.